This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. September is Fashion Month, with massive week-long events in major cities worldwide, including New York, London, Milan, and Paris. And the question on many people's minds is, will we be seeing fur, or will more designers choose to follow the fur-free trend? PJ Smith, Director of Fashion Policy for Humane World for Animals, thinks the future of the industry is fur-free and joins Defender Radio to discuss trends, textile innovation, and what gives him optimism. I think to start, though, let's talk a little bit about you and what it is that you do at Humane World for Animals.
At the Humane World for Animals, or Humane World, I've been the Fashion Policy Director for 16 years now. That seems like a really long time, and it is a really long time. But in that time, it's been working with the fashion industry to move away from animal fur. It's about implementing policies that are good for animals. And that sort of, we had so much success on that front, getting these big retailers, these big brands to go fur free. That a lot of that has now shifted into policy, public policy work. So passing legislation, either banning fur sales in cities or states across the U.S. And then a lot of times it's working with my colleagues to ban fur production in Europe. A lot going on there that we can chat about, but there's just been a lot of progress on this issue specifically with fur within fashion. And it's seen just a massive decline, and there's some optimism there, which
Definitely.
it's hard to see in the world, optimism, but this is one thing you got.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting point, too, because when I started with the Fur Bearers around 10, 15 years ago, it was still very much, but it's fashionable, and here's why we need to use it. And there was a lot of reasons to keep using fur in fashion. But now a lot of the conversations, even for people who are still pro-fur, we're now talking ethics, sustainability, public health, issues like that. What do you think shifted, or how did it shift from just, this is a product that people like and we should still keep using it, to we need to have a serious conversation?
Yeah, I think what happened and why the fashion brands going fur free was so important to this, the decline of this trade, was despite of what people say they need or have to use it, it's always been just this status symbol that is associated with this product. And so it had an aspirational value that you had to sort of strip from this product. And when you have the luxury brands like Gucci and Valentino and Prada saying that this is not luxury, this is cruel, then that resonates not just, with your everyday average consumer, but it resonates with the elites and the people that are buying these $20,000 jackets, and not just here in North America, but globally, because China was the biggest the biggest producer of fur. It was the biggest buyer of fur. But when you have these big brands going fur free, that makes an impact there. And so I always joke around because, especially coming from Canada, a lot of people think most of the fur sales are at least here in the US, it's going to be Wisconsin or Minnesota or New England where it's a little cold. Nope. It's Miami. It's Dallas, it's Los Angeles before they banned fur sales. And so it's always going to be a status symbol, always has been, in the modern day world. But I think the brands going fur free was really important to getting that sort of removed, that sort of aspirational value removed. And I would also say just there was a generational sort of connection too. A lot of us have mothers, grandmothers that had a fur coat and what that meant to them, because that was that status
Yeah,
symbol
for sure.
for them. And that's sort of been broken. That cycle has been broken with this generation, where we're not going to see future generations having that connection to this product. So that's why I'm really optimistic, because those two things have changed, and I don't really see, because of the policies that were being put into place right now, I don't see it coming back,
Yeah.
which is cool.
Yeah, and it's very insightful. I had not really considered that, sort of the generational relation to it. I mean, obviously, we're of an age. My grandmother had her furs, and I remember they smelled of stale cigarette smoke in the Winnipeg winters, and she'd always have Scotch mints in her pocket. And after she died, we had them in my mom's closet, who never touched them. And they just kind of sat there because it was, well, it's a connection to this person. It did mean a lot to her. She would have got it in the 30s or 40s in a, somewhat scarcity era. And this is the coat that's going to last her the rest of her life. But we
Mm-hmm.
have better materials now. We have more understanding. Even the need for protection from the cold in Canada is changing. So
Mm-hmm.
it is interesting, though, to consider how much of a relationship that could influence. That relationship could influence people's purchases. So
No, I
it's
think it's
yeah,
meeting with like designers. So many of them have stories like that. Like
yeah,
their mother had a fur, their grandmother, and it's almost like we're not demonizing your grandparents
yeah.
for doing that, but I do think that there is a connection there,
Hmm.
that everyone has to think about. Being like, wait, did my grandparents do something wrong? No, I mean, it was the knowledge wasn't there.
Yep,
We didn't have the internet. I always think about how important the internet was to these sort of things, so that
definitely.
we, for the first time, you could see a live skinning of a raccoon dog, or what it's like on a fur farm. I mean, that knowledge wasn't there before, so we have it, and we need to change accordingly.
Yeah. And you had spoken about how the luxury brands have really been making waves by making statements about cruelty and unnecessary fur. Are there any particular brands that have stood out as leaders to you? And why would they be sort of maybe top of mind for you in that way?
Yeah, so I think the leaders now are the ones that are trying to replace that sort of status symbol with that luxury status symbol with innovation.
Hmm.
So it's trying to say, okay, this old idea for being a luxury product is out the door, and we're going to replace it with innovation. And a lot of times, innovation isn't perfect. A lot of
Yep.
these brands are looking for, best, good for the environment, has the quality to hold up, and doesn't use animals. And I say, I mean, it's going to be a long evolution of getting to the point where we're going to have these perfect products. But there are certain brands like Stella McCartney, obviously, is a name that's always being thrown out there. Ghani, these are companies that are willing to celebrate progress of innovation. So they're using the new bio-based faux furs, and even the bio-based leathers that
Yeah.
they're coming out. They're celebrating that, and they're demystifying these products as being, not as of quality. And we'll get there. It's about the progress and getting it to that point of perfection. And then when we're there, all this becomes pointless. Like,
Yeah.
why would we ever do that when we have a perfect alternative that is not plastic? It looks and feels just like the same thing. And I think we're close. And it's those brands that I think are celebrating. Obviously, like Gucci has their version of faux fur, and there's so many that, I one point that I think is always interesting to make is, like the price point. A lot of people think the faux fur price point is a whole lot lower, but when these luxury brands went for free, you could now go and buy like a $20,000 Givenchy faux fur coat.
Hmm.
So it has that luxury status associated because it has that brand
Yeah.
name on that product, which is what the value is. And it never was fur. Like, I mean, a full length chinchilla is going to be quite expensive, but like that trim on a Canada Goose jacket or on a Moncler jacket is dollars.
Yeah.
It's not like luxury. It's not aspirational. It's quite cheap, if you ask me. So it's interesting that we're now getting to the point where the faux fur is at the same price point
Mhm.
as as animal fur.
Yeah, and that's great. It's the same thing we see in plant-based meat alternatives and stuff. Is when they come out, there's a lot of different types, and they sort of some of them fall off, get purchased, things change, but then over time it becomes sort of normalized. And here, where I live in Hamilton, it's hard to find a restaurant where you can't go and say, "Oh, give me a plant-based patty," and they've got at least one somewhere in the back. It's just become
Yeah.
normal at this point. Whereas 10 years ago, they would have laughed at you or said, "Well, we've got black beans and I can squish them for you." So it's interesting to see that, but at the same time, when we're talking about innovation, we're also going to have the occasional Cybertruck, where it's like, "Cool, I'm glad you tried. Let's keep trying."
Yep.
And on that note, are there areas in the fashion world where fur, traditional real fur, is still hanging on, and what's causing that?
Well, I mean, the big elephant in the room is obviously LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Dior, Fendi.
Hmm.
They have a little bit of a different sort of business structure than like the Carings of the world. And so they're not just using fur, they're lobbying on the fur trade's behalf. They actually fund the International Fur Federation to quite a significant percentage of their
Hmm.
budget. So you do know that there is one brand, that is behind this trade still being around right now.
Yeah.
And so I think it's going to be some time. I think what's happening in Europe, LVMH spent you know, the last decade saying that European fur was better than all other fur, and they would never source from China. And now we're in a situation where Europe could be moving away from fur production,
Yep.
pretty soon, through several different sort of policy shifts that are happening there. And so LVMH, which has spent that time trumping up their fur from Europe, is going to be in a situation where they're going to have to source fur from China if they want to sell it. And that'll be really interesting to see how they can convince themselves that that is okay. And so outside of that, like I think it's important, getting so many of these brands to go for free, knowing that fashion is cyclical.
Hmm.
Trends come and go. I still don't know what jeans I'm supposed to be wearing right now to be cool, but I
Yep.
know that I'm not wearing them, and I don't think I can make that change. But um, I do know that like we now need to work with the institutions that keep this sort of trend alive, and that's fashion magazines. So
Hmm.
getting like Vogue to have a fur-free policy, getting Harper's Bazaar to have a fur-free policy is important. Getting fashion weeks to have fur-free policies is important. So
Yeah.
London Fashion Week went fur-free, but getting the big ones like Milan and New York to have policies as well, I think will again ensure that this sort of trend, this cycle will not ever return. And so then we're kind of left with, and this is kind of what we saw last February, where you have either the fashionistas on the street wearing vintage,
Hmm.
and on the runway, you have faux fur and shearling. And we're at a point where reporters don't know the difference.
Interesting.
Fashion reporters don't know the difference. And so they just say fur is back, not
Mm.
understanding it's the nuances, the complexities of these policies that have been put into place, and they are quite effective because we are talking about vintage, shearling, and faux fur, which are all outside of the scope of new fur animals on fur farms today being killed just for today's fashion. It's nuanced, and
Yeah.
it's like, where do we get to that point where people are no longer going to even want to wear vintage fur? Maybe they're not going to want to wear shearling or faux fur, but this is where we're at right now. And I think, again, it's not to get too scared, but like, fur is back. No, it's just changed.
Yeah.
And it's going to keep on changing. So I think it's something that obviously we should celebrate the policies that have been put into place because they've gotten to this point. But it does become more complex. How does this end? Is the big question.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You're talking about a lot of the policies and the international movements and impacts, and very briefly, a few of those include designating American mink, Neovosin. I don't know how to pronounce it. That's how you spell it, though.
Yeah.
As or Neogale Voisin. Anyway, they're introducing it as an invasive species in some policy, which would mean keeping mink for the purposes of fur farming would be illegal. Which again makes sense because they do escape, as we know. That's just part of the business. And they very quickly can start breeding and setting up local populations. And we've also seen countries like Denmark, where they found COVID in the fur farms, listened to their scientific panels, and went, yep, we're going to make it a whole lot worse if we keep doing this, and shut it all down. And are now in that position of, well, is it going to come back? Or if it does come back, can it come back safely? So we're seeing some of those big shifts. Um, you noted that a lot of brands are going to have to deal with that? Is that something you're hearing about in industry at all, or as part of Fashion Week? Just this concept that fur as a textile will be less available now than it was a few years ago, and remarkably could be very difficult to source at some point.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything from industry, just primarily because, so many of them are out of it, so they don't
Yeah,
even talk about it anymore. Most of them shifted to leather and exotic skins to having those discussions at this point. But yeah, I mean, you're 100% right, where you're going to have potentially, mink production gone from Europe. I will say, raccoon dog was
hmm,
listed as an invasive species in Europe over a decade ago, and they still allowed member states to sort of request to continue production for a
yeah,
certain amount of time. And they gave countries, again, this is an invasive species. You're talking about hundred thousands of animals on one like farm, and they can escape, like you said. And they gave them 30 years to
jeez,
move away for raccoon dog production. So if they do that with mink, they're saying it's a problem. They're
yeah,
saying it's an invasive species, but they're potentially going to give them sort of an out to continue production. A lot of countries have already banned it, so it's not going to be a big deal. But the big ones like Denmark or Greece or Finland, they're going to keep on producing it with that sort of window that they're allowed to do. So we are asking, the agencies there to wait for this other policy that's being that citizens initiative that
yep,
got, millions of signatures that said that we want to move Europe to move away from production and to not allow it on their marketplace. So the first step of that was, let's let the European Food and Safety Authority come back with a report to say, what is the risks here from an animal welfare perspective. So not long ago, they came out with that report, and it was exactly what we thought it would say. It
yeah,
said you cannot keep these species in these cage systems and expect anything but, bad welfare for these animals. And so that was step one. Step two is, European Commission has to come up with a policy to respond to that citizens initiative. And so this is going to be quite a long process, but that was step one. And now step two, is coming hopefully this summer, where we're going to see, or this fall, see legislation. And so again, that could, along with his invasive species listing, could be the end of fur production in Europe,
yeah.
which is, that's where a lot of fur comes from outside of China. So it's just going to be really interesting to see how, the fur trade responds to that. Like it's one of those things I asked, how does this end? How does the fur trade end? What do we say? When do we say that we won? You
Hmm.
know, in preventing this cruelty. And I think it's almost, there's always going to be a black market for things,
Yep.
and so there's always going to be this little production, but for the most part, we're going to see this industry sort of collapse, and we're seeing it now. And I think like we're just going to continue. It's been an 85% decline in the fur trade globally since 2014.
Yeah.
So that is what I consider a collapse, and we now are at that point where we can really end this.
Yep.
And it's about just it wasn't never about like we need to end this trade, but we needed to shift demand just enough to make production no longer economically viable. And that was about reducing the value of a mink pelt or a fox pelt by $1 or
Yeah.
two. Like, and that's what we've been able to do. So now it's at a point where farmers are losing hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars every year, thinking some of them are still thinking it's going to come back. Maybe Russia's going to be friendly again. Maybe
Yeah, could happen.
maybe these things are going to change, but the I think the writing on the wall now is they have to sort of transition
Yeah.
to other trades because it's just no longer they're not making money anymore.
And that's the part I find very curious. I understand the folks who said, well, this has been my farm for 3 generations. We've raised mink, we've done foxes, we care, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want this industry to die. And at the same time, see the writing on the wall and go, okay, that's our past. What's our future?
Mhm.
And I know right now in Canada, much of the United States, if you took an average size mink fur farm, you could convert that to produce local indoor greenhouse stuff with not a lot of money. You could start doing soil remediation if you wanted. Like there's so many potential projects you can convert to very quickly with a small innovation grant or a small investment and just start making money again. I mean, growing tomatoes is harder now than it used to be. But if you've got the space to put up a greenhouse, you can provide a small community fresh produce year round and make a living at it.
Yeah.
If right there's to me there's fewer and fewer reasons to not make that transition. And I think as long as governments are supportive of that, like you want to do something new that's better for everybody, sure, we'll help you. And I think generally it's hard to find, but I know some of those exist. It is a potential future for a lot of people who know that land, who know how to work hard. It could be valuable for everybody.
Yeah. And that leads me to asking you a question. I'm not as up to date on what y'all are doing up there in Canada and I know you guys have a citizens initiative that probably had some success recently, and I'd love to hear
Yep.
from that about that.
Yeah.
Fur Bearers is behind that 100%.
Well, thanks for asking. Yeah. So we, unfortunately, in Canada, don't have the ability to introduce policy on our own by a vote, like a lot of other, including the United States, you can do. But we do have a federal petition process that's sponsored by a member of parliament, so a federal representative, and then able to get signatures. We had over 10,000 signatures calling for an end to fur farming in Canada. And the benefit of this system is it requires a formal response from the government. So they can't just go, oh, neat petition and walk away. It gets read into the House of Commons. It becomes part of the historic record that all of these people are saying, because of all of these reasons, we want to see an end. And then the government has to table a response, whichever way they go, then gives us more information on how do we move forward. In Canada, we're also seeing a drastic decline in fur farms overall for exactly the same reasons. If it costs, say, $40 to produce a mink pelt and you're selling it for 41 or 39, that's not sustainable. And we do know some fur farmers are transitioning into new businesses. So we are seeing a lot of change. Canada Goose was one of the big ones up here for us a few years ago, as listeners likely know. They moved away from using new fur. And we're seeing a lot more people, I think, just generally realize, like, hey, this isn't cool. It's not something folks are interested in. So we are seeing definitely positive steps. And I think it'll be interesting. It's hard to see right now. But with the Hudson's Bay Company, the historic corporation that was largely responsible for the European fur trade in the early days of North America and colonization, they shut down. The business was no longer sustainable. And they were one of the last big businesses. I don't know if they still had it, but they were still doing cold storage and stuff for furs a few years ago. So again, it's just people just aren't interested in that model anymore, I think.
Yeah.
And it's great to see.
It was amazing how fast Canada sort of corrected itself on that, where you had the Canada Goose, the Moncler, the Moose Knuckles, the Holt
Yep.
Renfrews. They all just like made that shift in a very short time period. And, Canada and US being the main providers of trapped fur in the
Hmm.
world, it's amazing that just like because of Canada Goose, because of that look no longer becoming, being popular, like coyote pelt prices have just never rebounded.
Oh
It's
yeah.
just that so low that it's not worth it for trappers anymore.
Yep.
And that is such a shift because those brands went for free, and that look became unpopular. One thing that I always think is interesting is, we can track fur imports, we can track faux fur imports in the United States
Mhm.
and globally. And a lot of people thought, okay, well, faux fur is bad for the environment. That's what the fur trade was telling us.
Yeah.
What happened though was the look became not popular. So at the same rate that fur went down as far as imports into the United States, at least, faux fur followed that same trend. It just went down as well. So it's like across
It's
the
incredible.
board, good, because it's just less of
Yeah.
stuff. And we all should be less, we should all embrace less of things, especially with
Absolutely.
fashion, because of its huge, not just impact on animals, but its impact on the environment. And so obviously we're seeing innovation now on faux fur where it's getting better and better. But I always think it's really interesting that, that look just went away when these companies
Yeah.
started having those policies. And that's all around good.
Talking about the carbon footprint and stuff, that has been one of the big complaints was, oh, well, you're just using plastic instead, which, as you noted, is no longer the case. There's a lot of bio based products. Cactus leather, I know, is one that they've spent a lot of time experimenting with. And I think probably some of the interesting genetic cellular processing, I can't think of the term for right now, where they're effectively cloning stuff without making
Sure.
it.
Yeah.
Interesting things like that. When we compare that to fur, is the footprint still higher like it used to be with the old plastic based stuff, or has it kind of balanced out or come down more?
I mean, fur has always been, the highest impact material out there. I mean, per
Mhm.
kilogram, it's more than leather. And the reason behind that is, when the fashion industry sort of looks at an impact of a material or something, they do look at the entire supply. So like when they're looking at leather, they only account for their environmental impact, fashion that is, for 3 to 5% of that cow. So the rest
Okay.
they're saying is the beef industry is responsible for and things like
Not
that.
us.
They
Yeah.
can't say that for fur because that animal was solely raised
Yep.
for its pelt. And and so they have to, acknowledge the full impact of that animal. So you're talking about an animal that you're raising for, nearly a year, feeding, so all the food, that has an impact. Then you're talking about this animal that's, the waste that's going into
Yep.
waterways and going into the soil. That's just one part of it. Then after skinning the animal, it has to be treated with formaldehyde, chromium, all these toxic chemicals just to make sure it doesn't rot on the hanger. And so that impact is just so great that when these fashion brands, and this is going to be a shift that I think is going to be really the next step that we're going to see in fashion, is it's happening in Europe, it's happening in little pockets in around the US where they're passing these fashion acts, which just say fashion industries, fashion brands, fashion retailers have to make their environmental impact public, that
Yep.
data. And what we're hoping that's going to do is going to shine a big old spotlight on these animal industries, leather, exotic skins, even for certain part, it's going to be wool because of the amount of land use. And it's going to really say, okay, we need to reduce these materials and we need to start bringing in either recycled materials or we need to start bringing in new innovative materials. And I think that that's going to be this shift that we're going to see in the next, 5 to 10 years, where more innovation is going to come and we're going to start seeing, more buyback programs and stuff like that. Again,
Yep.
it's all going to be good and it's going to be less animals being killed just for fashion. And so I'm really excited. It's just like trying to find quality faux leather back in the day meant
Oh, yeah.
it was going to be this polyurethane thing,
Yep.
and
Looks
it's just not
shiny and
that way
plastic.
anymore. Yeah.
Hmm.
And so I mean, I know there's going to be this transition period because a lot of times, cactus leather, whereas I've saw banana leather, I'm
Yep.
seeing every vegetable out there, they're making leather out of it. But a lot of times they're putting polyurethane on it and it still is. But I'll tell you, like, the leather industry is not telling you they put polyurethane on most things as well. If you ever see a shiny leather item, that's polyurethane. So you're
Mhm.
buying plastic leather as well. So that's such a huge environmental impact. But yeah, there's good reason to be optimistic because of this shift, not just on animal welfare, but part of the larger sustainability movement.
Yeah, and I actually had a question, and you've done this 3 times now, so I'm just going to force you to go back. You answer the question right before I ask it. Of the future of truly ethical fashion. And again, it's a big question, I think, because talking about fur kind of makes it streamlined. But when we start talking about all of these other things, all of the other animal products, polyurethanes and other plastics and polymers, and then even just shipping labor for fast fashion and stuff like that. So, what does that look like to you? And is it something that's within our reach? Is this something that we're going to see in our generation?
Yeah, I mean, it is a big question mark. It's a big problem too, where we can survey Gen Z, whatever generation you want, and they're going to say they care about the environment, they care about animal welfare. But if it's a good deal on Sheen, they're going to buy
Hmm.
it. And
Yeah.
so what the surveys, what they say is not necessarily what we're seeing at the cash register. And that's a problem. And so I think there's still going to be this push of less.
Hmm.
We need to buy less. But that's also like consumerism, and
Yep.
capitalism really fights against that in general. And so I do think it's on the brands, and that's where policy comes into place. We're no longer going to wait around for consumers. The planet is dying, and brands need to be held responsible, and they're the ones that are responsible with taking the consumers along with them, hand holding them to say, we're going to bring, it's going to be popular to recycled materials. I
Hmm.
know that regenerative agriculture is going to be more and more a thing. It's problematic.
Yep.
It's not going to be the answer, but it's going to be a part of the answer. And then I do think like the innovation has to get there. And the biggest problem with innovation, at least for materials at this point, is the ones that have said we want to have the entire supply chain and we have control of it, so we're building factories, we're doing all this stuff. They're failing because it's just like you build up this big thing, and if that demand's not there, you collapse pretty quickly.
Yep.
We need to use what's already here, so we need to use the tanneries that are already tanning leather. We need to have them tanning faux leather. We
Hmm.
need to have these big factories that are already doing this stuff. That's the way these companies are going to scale, and we're going to have, it's going to meet the demand for these materials, and the quality will get better and better. Right now, just speaking on leather, there's really two paths forward. If you're a startup that wants to replace leather because it's such a huge industry, you're either going automobiles, the
Hmm.
interiors, or you're going high luxury because you need to get to that price point to help scale.
Yeah.
And I do think that the companies that are starting up right now are wise to the fact that they need to have their supply chain integrated into what's already existing. And that's how they're going to scale very quickly. And so it's
Yeah.
little like behind the scenes stuff that's going to really allow the industry to become cleaner, more humane. Um, and we're already seeing it.
Great. And then just to flip it around, we've been talking a lot about what's behind the scenes, what's going on, but we are, in and around Fashion Week when this is going to be dropping, and fashion shows for the season are ongoing. So, folks who are sitting at home and seeing fur on a runway or on a store shelf, What can they do to help push forward the fur-free change that we want to see happen?
Sure. So I think obviously if you're seeing a brand or retailer selling it, it's always nice to drop them a note and say,
Mhm.
you know what, I'm not coming back until you guys move away from this product. That's a really easy thing to do. The other is obviously talking to your family and friends about this industry. We all have those aunts that don't really care and
Mhm.
are potentially wearing fur. So I think it's important that they see some of that stuff. The only thing that I've seen that actually changes the mind of somebody that is actively wearing fur is for them to see footage
Yeah.
of a fur farm. And there is so much out there. I remember it was, back in 2005, there was that live skinning of a
Yep.
raccoon dog at a fur market that just raised everybody's, idea of what the fur industry looks like. Um, but every year since I think 2012, there's been an investigation on a fur farm, whether it's in Finland where they supposedly have high standards. They don't. It's same as everywhere. Or it's the fur industry from China, where they literally have no sort of standards or regulations, and they are just clubbing them over the head or using these
Yep.
electric probes. Um, and seeing that changes people very quickly, being like,
Yeah.
I don't want to wear that cruelty. I don't want, my who it's fashion is very ingrained of who we are, and you don't want to be associated with that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's making sure your friends and your family see some of that footage, especially the ones that are still buying fur. And then it's about, celebrating that innovation. And it
Mhm.
really is at this point. We want there to be a demand for it. We want companies to say, okay, people care about not having animals or plastic or anything in our materials, and I'm going to celebrate that by buying it. And so I think that that's going to be like a huge shift in the demand is being able to consumers to embrace innovation. And for me, it's cheese. Whenever the
Mm.
vegan cheese coming out, I don't care if I'm not going to like it or not. I'm buying it because I
Yep.
like want to try it. A, but B, I want to show that there's a demand there, and so we can do that with fashion as well.
Awesome. And then to wrap up, the one message, if you could sit down across from all of the designers, all of the editors, and have one message for the fashion industry through, Fashion Week and the oncoming seasons, what would that message be?
I can tell you back in the day when I would work with these brands, I just told you that the only way you're going to change consumers is showing them the videos. That wasn't the
Mhm.
case with brands and retailers. You would show them the videos and they'd say, I don't want to see that again. And
Yep.
then that would sort of end the conversation. The things that changed the way that the companies started listening was consumers changed. And so we were able to, if they started doing their own sort of internal surveys, they started realizing, okay, our consumers really care about animals and we're not doing anything. So like the fur free policies was really the first time most of these brands or retailers had any sort of animal welfare policy. And now they're quite extensive, which is cool to see. Like that was the beginning. This is where we're at now. But if I could say that to all these brands or designers and retailers, I would say this change is happening
Mhm.
with or without you. And you would be really smart as a business to not to just get on that bandwagon now rather than be late. And I think that that's the power of the bandwagon effect is pretty important, especially if you look at how fast the fur industry went from selling a lot of fur to no fur. It's because these big brands that were really popular made very public announcements. And so you looked like an idiot if you weren't going to get on board. And so, for the few that are remaining, even in talking about exotic skins, leather, wool, down, this change is going to happen one way or the other, and you'd be really smart as a business to get ahead of it. And so, that's what I would say if I got to talk to all of them. But you know what? They already know it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
The-
more about just like let's squeeze some money out of it here, and we're doing a lot of that innovation stuff behind the scenes, but we'll get there.
Find out more about PJ Smith and Humane World for Animals by visiting them online at humaneworld.org or finding them on social media channels. Thanks, PJ, for all of your insights, time, and that optimism. And I want to thank you, listener, for joining us. Follow the Fur Bears on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or Blue Sky to get updates on Defender Radio and other campaigns and programs. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bears, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.